I'm watching my hands shake so badly I can't hold the keys, and I'm sitting in a car that's supposed to keep my newborn twins warm, and I'm realizing that my entire life just collapsed in approximately 45 seconds. The divorce papers, they're still on the kitchen table of a house I helped pay for with money I earned, and I'm out here in the December cold with two babies who don't understand that their mother is making what might be the worst decision of her life, or possibly the best one, and I genuinely cannot tell which. My name is Melissa. I'm 38 years old. I was, until today, married to someone I trusted with everything. And what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to understand something before we even begin. Betrayal, at the scale I experience, doesn't happen randomly. It's planned. It's systematic. And it almost worked. Let me take you back to 3 days before that moment in the car, because that's where the real story starts. Not with the leaving, but with the coming home. I'd just been released from Memorial Hermann Hospital in Houston with two perfect boys, Marcus and Owen, both healthy, both sleeping, and I was running on fumes. An emergency C-section does things to your body that you cannot prepare for, no matter how many classes you take or books you read. I couldn't stand without pain shooting through my abdomen. I couldn't sit for longer than 20 minutes without needing to move. My breast tissue felt like it was on fire from feeding two babies simultaneously. And my brain was operating on maybe 2 hours of actual sleep, the rest being that fragmented, nightmare-filled rest that hospitals give you when nurses check on you every hour. I remember pulling into my driveway that Thursday morning, my husband Daniel helping me out of the car like I was made of glass, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is the hardest part. From here, everything gets easier. That thought was the biggest delusion I've ever experienced. My mother-in-law was already there. Patricia. She'd been waiting at the house to help, which is what she called standing in my kitchen, criticizing every single thing I did. She told me my swaddling technique was wrong. She told me that bottle feeding was lazy and that real mothers breastfed exclusively. She told me that the way I was holding Marcus was going to give him scoliosis. None of it was said with kindness. It was all delivered with this edge, like she was teaching a child something obvious. By the second day, I had stopped responding. By the third day, I was just trying to survive until she left. Except she wasn't going to leave. I didn't know that yet, but that's because I was too sleep-deprived to read the signs that were already flashing red all around me. Daniel came home that evening, Wednesday evening. The evening everything changed and he wasn't alone. He brought his boss with him. Her name was Cassandra, and she had this presence that made the air feel different when she walked into a room. She was probably 45, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored coat that cost more than my monthly car payment, with red lipstick that didn't have a single smudge despite being the end of a workday. She looked around my living room the way a developer looks at property before deciding whether to buy it. Clinical. Evaluative. Like she was calculating the square footage and the potential for profit. And I remember thinking, and I want you to understand how sleep-deprived and vulnerable I was in this moment. I remember thinking, why is she here? Why is his boss at my house right now? I was holding Owen against my chest. He was sleeping, his tiny fingers gripping my shirt in that way. Newborns do, like they're afraid you're going to disappear if they don't hold on. Marcus was sleeping in the bassinet next to the couch, and Daniel turned to me with this expression I'd never seen on his face before. This expression of certainty, of entitlement. This is the look people have when they believe they've already won something. "Melissa," he said. And he said it very quietly, very carefully, like he was talking to someone who might break. "I need you to sign something." And that's when Patricia stepped aside, and Cassandra stepped forward, and she laid a manila envelope on the coffee table, right there next to my pump, right there next to the burp cloth, right there in the space that was supposed to be safe, and she said, very softly, "These are the separation agreement papers. We recommend expedience." "We?" I looked at her. "We recommend? I'm lying here 3 days after giving birth, and you're standing in my house that I've helped pay for, that I've decorated, that I've made safe for my babies, and you're saying we?" I looked at Daniel. He wouldn't meet my eyes. That's the moment I understood. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned. They'd planned this together. The room seemed to tilt. Owen shifted in my arms, and I held him tighter, which meant I was holding him too tight, which meant he started to fuss, which meant I was already failing at protecting him from the stress of this moment, and we were only seconds in. Patricia made a noise, not quite a gasp, more like a disapproving sigh. The kind of sound a person makes when they've been proven right about something terrible. And I realized, with this slow, horrible clarity, that she had known. The whole time she was standing in my kitchen criticizing the way I folded baby blankets, she already knew her son was leaving me. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked. I asked it the way a person asks a question when they don't really believe there's an answer. When they're just trying to make sense of a world that suddenly inverted itself. Owen was whimpering now. Marcus was starting to stir. And Cassandra, Daniel's boss, she looked at me like I'd asked a completely reasonable question, like we were having a normal conversation about logistics. And she said, "There are resources. Family shelters. Places that help in situations like this." "Situations like this?" I repeated. Did she just call this a situation? Like I was a scheduling problem? Like my family was an inconvenience in someone's calendar? Patricia pointed toward the front door. "You should take your things and your children and leave. You've embarrassed this family long enough." And I actually remember this thought forming crystal clear in my head despite being half asleep and in physical pain. I remember thinking, how am I embarrassing them? What exactly have I done to embarrass them? I'm the one being thrown out by a man I've been building a life with for 12 years. I'm the one who just destroyed my body to give birth to his children. I'm the one who trusted him. And then Owen started crying, not the little newborn fuss, but real crying. That desperate, confused newborn crying that means something is fundamentally wrong and he doesn't understand what, but his body knows. Marcus woke up at the sound. And suddenly I'm holding one baby and watching another one panic, and my mother-in-law is pointing at the door, and my husband won't look at me, and his boss is standing there like she's waiting to make sure I actually leave. I looked at the Christmas stockings. They were hanging over the fireplace in my living room. My name on one, Daniel's name on another that said Dad, even though he hadn't changed a single diaper since we came home. The boys' names on two little stockings they were too small to use yet. That detail broke something in me more than anything else had. The stockings. The assumption of a future that wasn't going to happen. I didn't sign the papers. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anyone out of my house. I just picked up the diaper bag, tucked both babies inside my coat as carefully as I could manage, and walked out into weather so cold it felt like punishment. By the time I reached my old Honda CR-V, my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the keys. Twice. The first time I bent to pick them up, I was terrified I would drop Owen. The second time I picked them up, I was terrified that I was making the biggest mistake of my life by leaving. Both fears were screaming at me with equal volume. Both felt true, but staying in that house felt worse than both of them combined. And that's when you know you have to leave when staying feels like drowning. The heater coughed warm air that barely reached the front of the car. Both babies were crying now. Real crying. Hungry crying. Confused crying. Owen's little face was turning red. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, keys in the ignition, and I realized I had nowhere to go. No family in Houston. My parents were in Austin, 2 hours away. Friends were scattered across the city. And I couldn't just show up at someone's door at 9 at night with 2 screaming newborns and a story that sounded insane. Hotels wanted credit cards. And I suddenly had a horrible thought. Would he have already called the credit card company? Would he have already blocked access to our accounts? I didn't know how fast betrayal moved. I didn't know how strategic someone would be if they'd been planning this for months. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I called my battalion commander. Yes, I was still in the military. I'd taken maternity leave, and I still had 3 months left before my return date. Colonel Richard Watson answered on the second ring. "Sir, this is Captain Melissa Brooks. I'm sorry to call this late, but I need help." There was a pause. A good commander knows what that tone means. "Where are you?" "In my car. In my driveway. With my twins. I'm leaving my husband." Another pause. "Are you and the babies safe?" That was when I started crying. Not loud. I couldn't cry loud because the babies would panic. But silent tears just rolling down my face while I tried to keep my voice steady. No one had asked me that question all evening. Not Daniel. Not Patricia. Not Cassandra. No one had asked if I was safe. They'd only asked when I would sign and whether I would leave and what my problem was for not immediately understanding that my marriage was over. "I think so," I whispered. "Captain, I think so isn't good enough. Where are you going? I don't know, sir. I was going to. I don't know. And that's when Colonel Watson told me about the Armed Forces Retreat Center in the Woodlands, just outside of Houston. It's a place funded by military charities specifically for military families in crisis. He said he'd call ahead. He said, "This isn't charity, Captain. You've served your country. Let us take care of our own." And I remember feeling this strange sensation of being held by something bigger than my individual catastrophe. 40 minutes later, I pulled into the facility. The building itself was beautiful, a mid-century ranch-style house with wide porches and warm lights in every window. A woman was waiting for me at the entrance. Her name was Patricia, which was almost funny given the circumstances, and she was in her late 60s, wearing fuzzy slippers under her winter coat and a cardigan that looked like it had been knitted by someone who loved her very much. When she saw me standing there holding 2 crying babies, her face changed. It softened into something I can only describe as fierce compassion. "Oh, sweetheart," she said. And that's when I fell apart. Not in front of Daniel, not in front of his boss or my mother-in-law, but in front of a stranger who had the good sense not to ask questions, just to open the door wider and say, "Let's get those beautiful boys inside where it's warm." Kindness, I was learning, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sounds like someone heating a bottle in a kitchen at 9:30 at night. Sometimes it sounds like fresh sheets being pulled onto a bed in a guest room. Sometimes it sounds like Patricia saying, "I made a pot of soup. Would you like some? You look like you haven't eaten." I hadn't. Not since breakfast, 12 hours earlier. I'd been too focused on managing the crisis to remember that my body was also a body that needed food. The next morning, reality arrived with a force that made the previous night's abandonment seem like a warm-up. I was sitting in the small office that the center let visitors use, holding Owen while he napped, and I opened my laptop to do something I'd been dreading. I opened my banking app. My checking account had exactly $2,240 in it. The mortgage payment on the house that my parents had helped us buy, the house where I'd just been told to leave was due in 12 days. 12 days. And when I tried to add a charge for diapers to the joint credit card, my fingers were shaking as I typed in the number. Card declined. I tried again. Declined. I tried a third time, and at that point, I knew. He'd planned this. Every single detail. He had done this intentionally, which meant that the conversation about checking accounts, the decision to cut off my access, the logic of leaving me with nothing, all of that had happened before he came home with Cassandra, before he asked me to sign, before he watched me leave in the cold. He'd already decided I was gone. I was just going through the motions of leaving the body. Patricia, the volunteer. Patricia came into the office and saw me staring at the declined card notification on my screen. She didn't say anything. She just sat down beside me and looked at the screen herself. "Men like that usually plan very carefully," she said quietly, "and they always think they've planned well enough to account for everything." "Except they haven't," I asked. "Except they haven't," she confirmed. By noon that day, my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Have your attorney contact mine. The terms are straightforward." That was it. No questions about whether the babies had eaten. No asking if we'd made it to safety. No acknowledgement that I'd just left our home with 2 infants in the middle of a crisis. Just instructions. Just the logistics of disposal. 5 minutes later, another message. "Don't make this difficult, Melissa. Cassandra and I are moving forward together. I want a clean break. Cassandra and I." Not even 24 hours. Not even long enough to make sure his children weren't sleeping in a car. I deleted both messages, and then I did something that changed everything. I called the military legal assistance office and asked for someone who worked with family law. I got connected with Major Sarah Chen, and she listened to my story for nearly an hour without interrupting once. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and asked me a question that seemed simple, until I realized it wasn't simple at all. "Melissa, who paid the down payment on the house?" "My parents." "And whose names are on the original deed?" "My parents' names and mine. Daniel was added later, after we were married." Major Chen smiled. Not a cruel smile. A strategic smile. "Did you know that deed restrictions can be modified after the fact?" I didn't. Specifically, some deeds can require dual authorization for refinancing or sale, even if one spouse's name is added later. I felt something shift in my chest. Did your parents include such a restriction? I had no idea. I'd never even thought to ask. "There's one way to find out," Major Chen said. She opened a folder and wrote down my father's contact information. Call him tonight. Ask him specifically if he included a survivorship clause or refinancing restriction when he transferred your share to you. I did call him that night. My father, Marcus, I'm named after him by the way, and I named my son after him too. He listened to my story with the kind of quiet attention that only comes from someone who's been in crisis management his whole life. He ran a construction company in Austin, and he learned long ago that problems require evidence, not emotion. When I finished, he asked me to stay on the phone, and I heard him going through papers in his office. I heard the sound of him finding something, and then his voice came back. Melissa, I never fully transferred the deed. What do you mean? I mean that when I transferred your share, I specifically kept a clause in there that required my signature for any major refinancing or sale. I did it because I didn't trust Daniel. I'm sorry. I should have told you that I didn't trust him. I wasn't angry at my father for not telling me. In that moment, I was grateful. Because that meant that Daniel couldn't have just refinanced the house on his own. That meant that if he'd taken out a loan against the property, he would have needed to forge my father's signature, or he would have needed permission that he clearly didn't have. Dad, did he refinance the house? There was a long silence. Melissa, pull up your mortgage account online. I want you to check something. I opened it. I logged in. And there it was. A refinancing transaction dated 11 months ago. An amount of $285,000 borrowed against the property. A mortgage document with my father's signature on it, a signature that my father was sitting in Austin right now telling me he absolutely did not provide. Oh my God. Melissa, I think your husband committed mortgage fraud. That's not a civil matter anymore. That's a criminal one. And I think we need to talk about what happens next. Over the next week, working with Major Chen, and with my father's willingness to verify exactly what had been falsified, I started building a picture of what Daniel had done. And the more I dug, the more I found. Not just the mortgage fraud, but wire transfers. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, slowly draining from accounts I thought were shared, flowing to something called Holt Consulting LLC, Cassandra Holt. His boss, who had been standing in my house 3 days after I gave birth. I found social media posts from a company event 6 months earlier. Cassandra in a diamond bracelet I'd never seen before. Daniel with his arm around her at a beach house they'd purchased. And the timeline, oh God, the timeline. They'd been together since before I was even pregnant. He'd been lying during prenatal appointments. He'd been lying while we were naming our sons. He'd been lying while I was bleeding, and exhausted, and believing that we were about to become a family of 4. Patricia, volunteer. Patricia would find me sometimes just sitting in the kitchen at the center, staring at nothing. She'd sit down with me and not say anything. We'd just sit. Eventually, I'd tell her some new thing I'd discovered, some new layer of the lie, and she'd nod and say things like, "That's what happens when people have been dishonest for a long time. They get careless, the lies get bigger. They have to keep lying to cover the first lie. It's exhausting for them to keep it up, even if they don't realize it." 2 weeks after arriving at the center, my attorney Major Chen called me with news. She'd been pulling financial records, and she'd found a pattern. Every large transfer to Holt Consulting corresponded with a personal purchase. Jewelry, furniture, the down payment on the beach house. Daniel wasn't being strategic about covering his tracks. He was being stupid about it. He was taking money that belonged to our family and giving it to his boss, who was also his girlfriend. And he was doing it with his personal signature on wire transfers that anyone with basic accounting knowledge could trace in about 30 seconds. "Here's what I think happened," Major Chen told me. "I think your husband believed you would be too overwhelmed to investigate. I think he believed that postpartum you would be too emotional and too exhausted to think clearly. I think he believed that you would sign whatever he put in front of you because that's what he'd observed women do in his world. I think he miscalculated your strength." "I don't feel strong," I told her. "I feel like I'm barely holding on." "That's because strength isn't a feeling," Major Chen said. "Strength is what you do when you're barely holding on and you show up anyway." The next Monday, I walked into a meeting with Major Chen, and she had pulled together evidence of corporate malfeasance so significant that I realized this wasn't just about my marriage anymore. It was about Daniel and Cassandra's boss at the corporate level, a man named Richard Langford, who chaired the company's board. Cassandra had been funneling company money to herself through consulting fees while Richard had been signing off on it, presumably because she was benefiting him in ways that showed up in deleted emails and untraceable payments. Daniel was just the vehicle. He was the weapon they were using to steal from the company, and they were using the company theft to finance their lifestyle, and they were using that lifestyle to convince Daniel that he was important enough to deserve better than his wife and children. "We have enough here to go to the authorities," Major Chen said. "Or we have enough to wait and see what else your husband does, while he's feeling confident about his own cleverness." I chose the waiting. Over the next month, as November turned into December, I settled into a new normal. The twins grew. Owen smiled for the first time, that gummy, accidental smile that doesn't mean anything but feels like everything when you're exhausted and traumatized. Marcus learned to focus his eyes on my face, and I learned to be a single mother of newborns while simultaneously gathering evidence of my husband's crimes, which was exactly as fun as it sounds. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning, feed the babies, and then spend the time while they napped going through documents. Major Chen would come by after work with coffee and a legal pad. We'd sit at a table that was slowly being buried under financial records, mortgage documents, and wire transfer confirmations. Then, something unexpected happened. I got a call from Linda Vasquez. Linda had been my roommate in military service, back when we were both stationed in Germany, in 2012. We'd been close the way young soldiers get close, sharing nightmares, sharing dreams, sharing the specific kind of friendship that only happens when you're both far from home and afraid that you might die. After leaving the military, Linda had built a career in television journalism. She was now the news director at KHOU, one of Houston's major television stations. And somehow, through the interconnected web of military community, she'd heard what was happening to me. "I saw an opening," she told me on the phone. "A position in community outreach and veteran affairs. I want you to consider applying. After your maternity leave ends, I want you to work with me. I don't know your full situation, but I know your character, and that's enough for me to know I want you on my team." I was overwhelmed. I was also terrified. "Linda, my marriage it's falling apart. There might be legal stuff. I might be." I didn't even know how to finish that sentence. Liable? A criminal? A victim? All of the above? "Melissa, I've already checked your military record. 21 years of service is what I saw. Exemplary reviews. Multiple commendations. Bronze, that's what I'm hiring. That's the person I believe in. Everything else is just noise." But it wasn't just noise, because that same week Daniel called me, not to ask about the babies, not to apologize, but to threaten me in a way that was so calculated and so cruel that I almost couldn't process it. "Melissa, I know you've been interviewing at KHOU. I know you applied for that community outreach position. You should know that Cassandra speaks with Richard Langford about media partnerships as part of her consulting work, and we've already had a conversation about your application. I would adjust your expectations if I were you." I felt my stomach drop. He was going to destroy my career. He was going to use his boss, and his boss was going to use her connections to make sure I didn't get hired. He was going to take everything, the house, the money, my family's security, and now my future, and he was going to do it because he'd decided that I wasn't worth knowing anymore. But he'd made a mistake. He'd assumed that I was still the person I'd been 3 days postpartum, exhausted and confused and unable to think strategically. He didn't realize that I'd spent a month gathering evidence. He didn't realize that my military training, which he'd always dismissed, was exactly what I needed to stay calm under pressure and to see patterns that other people missed. He didn't realize that I'd already documented everything he was about to do. I called Linda back that same day. "If someone tries to tell you not to hire me, I want you to know that I'm aware it's happening, and I want you to know why." I told her everything. The affair, the mortgage fraud, the corporate malfeasance, the threats. And Linda listened the way she'd listened to me in Germany when I was 18 and terrified of war, and she was 18 and terrified too, but we both showed up anyway. "Melissa, people don't spend 21 years building a reputation on integrity by accident. You didn't do that by accident, and I'm not going to let some man and his boss convince me that the person I respect has suddenly become unreliable. If they call me, I will document it. I will write it down, and I will remember it." They did call. Cassandra called Linda directly and told her that I was emotionally unstable after giving birth, that I had anger issues, that I was unreliable and unsafe in a newsroom. She called 3 times over the course of 2 weeks, each time with a new reason why I shouldn't be hired. Linda documented every call. And that's when Linda did something extraordinary. She called me back and said, "Melissa, I'm putting you on the air. Not as an employee yet, as a featured guest. We're launching a segment about veterans rebuilding their lives after tragedy. I want you to be our first profile. And I want to do it right before you officially start the job, so when people see your story, they'll know exactly who you are and exactly what you're made of." The interview was scheduled for the second Saturday in March, exactly 4 months after I left my house in the cold. The morning of the interview, I woke up at 4:30 a.m. because Owen decided that 4:30 was his preferred feeding time, and Marcus agreed immediately. By 6, both boys were fed, changed, and wearing matching blue sweaters that Patricia had knitted for them herself. Patricia stood in the kitchen beaming like she'd invented babies. "They look like little soldiers," she said. "They look like my sons," I said. "And they look like they're going to be just fine because their mother is fierce." She wasn't wrong about that last part, though I didn't feel fierce. I felt terrified. Linda had arranged for a driver to pick me up. When we arrived at the KHOU studios in downtown Houston, Linda was waiting in the lobby. She hugged me before she said a word, and in that hug, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt like someone actually had my back. The interview itself was beautiful in its simplicity. The host, Michael Chen, didn't ask me about Daniel. He didn't ask me about Cassandra. He didn't ask me about the betrayal or the fraud or any of the darkness. He asked me about why I served. He asked me about my soldiers. He asked me what kept me going. He asked me about the twins, about why I'd chosen to keep their father's last name legally, even though I was changing my own. He asked me about what scared me most and what gave me hope. I cried. Not like I was falling apart, but like I was telling the truth about things that mattered. Michael handed me a tissue, and I laughed at the weirdness of sitting there with mascara running down my face in professional lighting. And then I told him about the moment I realized that my worst day might be the day I saved my own life. The interview aired on Saturday morning as scheduled. My father came up from Austin to watch it with me and the twins. Patricia made her famous pancakes. We sat in the small living room of the Armed Forces Retreat Center, and we watched my face appear on the television. But I wasn't the only person watching. Across town, Daniel was at home watching too. He was sitting in a house that he'd bought with money he'd stolen, and he was watching his wife, his ex-wife, soon to be officially tell the entire city of Houston that she was stronger than his betrayal. He was watching his newborn sons smile while their mother talked about integrity. He was watching the life he thought he was building collapse in real time because the person he'd underestimated had stopped being underestimatable. That's when everything changed. I got a call from Tom Brennan, Daniel's former accountant. Tom had worked with Daniel for years, and he'd quit 3 months ago because Daniel had asked him to sign off on financial statements that were systematically dishonest. Tom had kept copies of everything, and he'd been waiting to see if I would figure it out on my own. He had. And when he saw me on television, he made a decision. "Melissa, there are things you need to know about your husband's finances. Things that go deeper than just the mortgage fraud. Can you meet me?" I met Tom at a small restaurant in Pearland that evening. He handed me a thick folder and told me about every single payment Daniel had made to Cassandra's company. He told me about payments labeled as consulting fees that were actually personal loans. He told me about company funds used to purchase the beach house. He told me that what Daniel and Cassandra had done wasn't just infidelity, it was theft. Corporate theft. And the people at the top, Richard Langford and the board of directors, they'd known about it. They'd known and approved it and benefited from it. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked Tom. "Because I have a daughter your age," he said quietly, "and if she came to me and said that her husband had done this to her, I would want someone to tell her the truth. The whole truth. Not the parts that make her feel better, but the parts that make her safe." Major Chen and I reviewed the evidence Tom provided. We organized it. We documented the chain of custody. And then Major Chen did something that changed the trajectory of everything. She connected me with a former military cyber specialist who was now working with a private security firm. This specialist, his name was Kevin, he examined the flash drive that had arrived anonymously at Major Chen's office, the one with Vanessa's deleted emails, the one that nobody was supposed to touch. What Kevin found was catastrophic. Cassandra and Richard Langford had been planning this for years. The email showed it. Richard wanted someone inside the company, someone's husband, to help him extract money for an investment scheme he was running. Cassandra found Daniel, seduced him, and convinced him that if he helped facilitate the theft, he'd be promoted, he'd be wealthy, he'd be important. They'd set the timeline carefully. They knew that people going through major life events like becoming fathers often make poor decisions. They'd waited until I was pregnant, until Daniel was starting to panic about providing for twins, until a sense of his own inadequacy would make him vulnerable to someone telling him he was actually extraordinary. And it had almost worked. The shareholder meeting was scheduled for the following Friday. I had stock in the company. I'd inherited it from my grandfather years ago, forgotten about it, and never mentioned it to Daniel. Tom had reminded me of its existence. It qualified me to attend the shareholder meeting. It qualified me to speak during the public question period. And it gave me legal standing to ask about corporate financial irregularities. The morning of the meeting, I put on my dress uniform, not because I needed attention, but because after 21 years of military service, that uniform is who I am. It's the part of me that knows how to stand in front of powerful people and not flinch. It's the part of me that was trained to tell the truth even when it cost something. My father, who'd come back up from Austin for the meeting, looked at me in that uniform and didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just squeezed my shoulder and held one of the twins while I walked to the car. The Holt Industrial Systems building is a 30-story glass tower downtown, 3 blocks from the courthouse. I'd been there twice during my marriage, and both times Daniel had asked me not to wear my uniform. People here don't understand military culture, he'd said. What he meant was, please don't remind them that I married someone with actual integrity. Standing in the lobby that morning, I realized that was the point exactly. 87 shareholders attended that meeting. Most of them were older men in expensive suits. I was the only person there in a military uniform. The receptionist didn't recognize my name until I showed her the stock certificate. Then her entire demeanor changed. I walked into the boardroom and immediately saw Daniel sitting in the 3rd row. The moment he saw me, all the color drained from his face. He whispered something to Cassandra, who was sitting beside him. She turned and looked at me, and for just 1 second, maybe less, I saw something that I hadn't expected to see. Fear. Pure fear. She suddenly understood that she'd miscalculated, and she didn't know how badly. Richard Langford ran through financial reports. Revenue, expansion, quarterly profits, nothing that mattered. And then he asked for shareholder questions. I stood up. The room went absolutely silent. There's a particular kind of silence that happens when an entire room realizes something has shifted and nobody knows why yet. This was that silence. I'd like to ask about executive expenses, I said calmly. Specifically, I'd like the board to explain wire transfers totaling over $100,000 to Holt Consulting LLC over the past 2 years. Cassandra's face went white. Our financial statements have been independently reviewed, Richard said smoothly. The lie came automatically. He was practiced at lying. I'm sure they have, I said. But an independent review is only as thorough as the information provided to the reviewers. I have documentation here that shows payments which do not appear in the official financial statements. I held up a folder. The room leaned forward. This wire transfer, approved by you personally, shows $126,000 transferred to Holt Consulting, then immediately transferred to a personal account held by Cassandra Holt. The payment is labeled consulting fees. Can you explain what consulting services justified that specific amount? Richard was trying to maintain control, but control requires confidence, and his confidence was cracking. I'm not familiar with that specific transaction. Then perhaps you can review it with your CFO. I slid the document up to the front of the room. The CFO took it. His face got darker as he read. I've never seen this, he said quietly. This was never submitted to my office for review. Perhaps it's in this other category then, I said, and I held up another document. Where company funds were used to purchase a residential property on the Chesapeake coast. The property is registered to Miss Holt, but the down payment came from corporate accounts. That would be embezzlement, correct? The room erupted. Whispers. Hands raised. Someone I didn't know said, "Is this true?" Another shareholder said, "I want those documents entered into the record." A third said, "Call the audit committee. This requires investigation." Daniel stood up suddenly. "This is ridiculous. You're making accusations with no basis. This is slander." "No," I said very calmly. "This is accounting. This is documentation. This is evidence. Slander would be if I was lying. I'm not lying. A few people actually laughed. Not loudly, just enough to understand that the room's sympathy had shifted. Mr. Langford, I continued, I also have emails. Deleted emails that have been recovered. In these emails, you and Miss Holt discuss using a specific employee, my husband, to facilitate property refinancing that was conducted without proper authorization. The emails specifically reference making sure, and I quote, Rachel signs quickly. We don't need unnecessary complications. You were discussing me. You were planning to use my postpartum vulnerability as a tool to commit fraud against my family. The room went completely still. The mortgages have been reviewed by forensic accountants, I said. The signatures are forged. The refinancing is fraudulent. And the money my family's home was used to borrow? It was funneled to Holt Consulting, and from there to personal accounts held by your boss and your boss's lover, while their lover's wife, me, was home with newborn twins, wondering how she was going to pay for diapers. I looked directly at Richard. You didn't just steal from your company. You didn't just commit fraud. You weaponized a family crisis to do it. And you assumed nobody would notice, because you assumed the person you were targeting was too tired to fight back. The chairman of the audit committee stood. I moved that this meeting be suspended pending a full forensic investigation and legal review. Seconded, someone said immediately. Security quietly approached Richard, then Cassandra, then Daniel. As they were being escorted from the room, Daniel turned and tried to make eye contact with me. I didn't look at him. I was already gone. 3 months later, I received a thick envelope from the Houston County District Attorney's Office. By that time, the twins were crawling. They were chasing each other across my father's living room in Austin. I'd moved back after the initial crisis passed. They were interested in dogtails and dust bunnies and all the things that babies are interested in. Not in the fact that their father had been indicted on multiple counts of embezzlement, wire fraud, and mortgage fraud. Not in the fact that his boss, their grandmother-adjacent figure, would be spending the next several years in federal prison. Not in the fact that their mother had just changed their last name from Carter to Brooks, my maiden name, and they would grow up with that clean break. Richard Langford resigned. 'Cause the money I received I put into a trust for the twins. I didn't touch it. It felt like blood money, like I was spending money that came from his lies and his theft. And even though legally it was restitution, emotionally it felt complicated. But here's what I did do. I took the job at KHOU. I built a career in veteran outreach. I told my story on television because I realized that stories have power. They have power to change how people think. They have power to make victims feel less alone. They have power to warn people, men and women, both, that betrayal follows patterns, that manipulation is calculated, that the person who seems most confident is often the person who's most desperate to hide something. I go back to the Armed Forces Retreat Center sometimes. Even now, even when I don't need shelter, even when I'm stable. I go back because Patricia is still there, still volunteering, still making pancakes for people whose lives just exploded. She always pretends to be shocked to see me and the twins, even though she knows we're coming. The boys run to her, and she picks them up like they're the most important thing she's ever held, which maybe they are, because she helped save them when they were tiny and frightened and had nowhere else to go. People ask me if I ever regret leaving that night. If I ever wonder what would have happened if I'd signed the divorce papers and just accepted the terms and tried to move forward quietly. The answer is no. But it's not no because revenge was sweet or because I enjoyed watching people I trusted go to prison. It's no because I finally understood something that took losing everything to figure out. Your worth isn't determined by the people around you. It's determined by what you do when those people prove they never saw your worth at all. I didn't win because Daniel failed. I won because I finally stopped letting him define what failure looked like. I stopped believing that my postpartum body was weakness. I stopped believing that my exhaustion meant I couldn't think. I stopped believing that my loyalty meant I had to accept disloyalty. If you're watching this, and you're in a situation where someone is telling you that you're not enough, or that you're too much, or that leaving is selfish when staying is survival, I want you to hear this clearly. Your instinct that something is wrong? It's right. Your fear? It's data. Your need to escape? It's not weakness, it's wisdom. And if you're watching this, and you've rebuilt your life from something that broke you, or if you're watching right now and you're in the middle of that rebuilding and it feels impossible, I see you. I'm telling you this story because I need you to know that impossible is just another word for not yet. It's not done. It's not finished. You're not finished. I want to ask you something before we finish. In the comments below, tell me, what would you have done in my position? Would you have signed those papers to keep the peace? Would you have fought back? And where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? I want to know. Because sometimes, knowing that someone across the country or across the world is listening to your story in their own crisis moment is what reminds you that you're not actually alone. That's what saved me. Knowing that other people had survived similar things. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel. Every week, I tell stories about real people who've overcome real obstacles, real people who've had to rebuild, real people who've discovered that they're stronger than they ever believed. That's who we are. That's who we're helping each other become. This is a fictional story, inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Houston, Texas, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.